I don't wish my life on anyone. Mike Tyson wasn't standing in a boxing ring when he said it. He wasn't bleeding. He wasn't angry. Nobody had just knocked him down. He was sitting across from Andre Ward, talking about a fight that hadn't even happened yet. Jake Paul was waiting. Millions of people were counting down the days. Most interviews at that point were about age, training, and whether a 58-year-old man still belonged in a boxing ring. Then Ward asked him a simple question. Looking back, had it all been worth it? Tyson didn't answer right away. His eyes filled with tears before he spoke. I don't wish my life on no one. As a whole, for a man who had spent decades trying to convince the world he feared nothing, it was one of the most honest things he had ever said. That answer stayed with me, not because it sounded dramatic, because it sounded relieved, almost like someone who had finally stopped pretending. Most people know Mike Tyson through a collection of moments. The knockouts, the stare, the black trunks, the ear bite, the prison sentence, the tiger, the fortune, the bankruptcy. Ask 10 people what they remember, and you'll probably hear 10 different answers. But very few will mention Michael Tyson, the man behind all of that. That's understandable. For almost 20 years, Mike Tyson didn't really have the luxury of being an ordinary person. Everywhere he went, he carried an identity that had become larger than himself. People didn't expect him to be thoughtful. They expected him to be terrifying. And for a long time, he gave them exactly what they wanted. If you grew up in the 1980s, you probably remember what a Tyson fight felt like. You didn't watch because you expected a long tactical battle. You watched because you were afraid you might miss the ending. There were nights when friends were still opening drinks while the fight was already over. People joked that if you walked to the kitchen at the wrong moment, you'd come back and see Tyson celebrating another knockout. It sounds exaggerated now. Back then, it wasn't. He became the youngest heavyweight champion in history at just 20 years old. And within a remarkably short time, he had unified boxing's major heavyweight titles, turning himself into one of the most recognizable athletes on the planet. But here's something that doesn't get talked about very often. Watch Tyson entering the ring in those old fights. Not the punches, not the knockouts. Just watch him walk. His face barely changes. He doesn't play to the crowd. He doesn't point at cameras. He doesn't smile. It's almost unsettling. He looks less like a man trying to win a fight, and more like someone going to work. Years later, Tyson admitted that much of his life had been driven by something far less glamorous than confidence. Fear. Fear of becoming nobody again. Fear of disappointing the man who believed in him. Fear of losing the identity that had rescued him from the streets. Listening to him now, you realize something surprising. The confidence everyone saw wasn't always confidence. Sometimes it was survival. That may also explain why November 2024 felt so different. When Tyson walked toward the ring to face Jake Paul, people weren't seeing the same man they remembered from Las Vegas in the late 80s. The beard had turned gray. His body moved differently. Not dramatically, just honestly. The fight itself almost became secondary. What people were really watching was time. Not because commentators said so, because many of the people watching had grown older with him. Someone who had watched Tyson knock out Michael Spinks in 1988 might now be retired. Someone who once watched him with their father might now be watching with their grandchildren. Without anyone saying it out loud, the fight became something else. It became a reunion with a part of people's own lives. Jake Paul won the decision. That part is easy to find in any headline. What interested me happened afterward. Tyson wasn't making excuses. He wasn't blaming judges. He wasn't talking about age. He simply accepted the result. That isn't the Mike Tyson many people expected. Then again, maybe the Mike Tyson most of us remember never really existed. Maybe we only knew the version the world needed him to play. Because long before the championships, long before the television cameras, long before anyone called him Iron Mike, there was a quiet kid in Brooklyn who spent hours taking care of pigeons. And if you really want to understand Mike Tyson, that's probably where the story has to begin. Long before the television cameras, the sold-out arenas, and the heavyweight championship belts, There was a boy who spent more time looking at pigeons than people. Mike Tyson grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, one of New York City's toughest neighborhoods during the late 1960s and 1970s. If you ask people who lived there back then, many will tell you the same thing. Kids learned very early how to recognize danger. You paid attention to who was walking behind you. You knew which streets to avoid after dark. And if someone decided to pick on you, there usually wasn't an adult around to stop it. Tyson wasn't the kind of child most people imagine when they think about one of the hardest punchers in boxing history. He was quiet. He spoke with a noticeable lisp. He wore thick glasses. He was heavier than many boys his age. Years later, he admitted that he was afraid much of the time, not the kind of fear people feel before giving a speech or taking a test. The kind of fear that comes from never quite knowing what might happen before the day is over. There was one place where that feeling eased: the rooftops. Tyson loved pigeons from an early age. He would spend hours taking care of them, feeding them, watching them circle above the neighborhood before returning to their coop. Looking back now, it almost feels symbolic. While the streets below demanded toughness, those rooftops offered something else entirely: quiet. No one expected anything from him there. No one cared whether he looked strong. For a little while, he could simply disappear. That didn't last. As Mike entered his early teens, he was arrested repeatedly for theft and street fights. By his own account, he was headed in a direction that rarely ended well. Eventually, he was sent to the Tryon School for Boys, a juvenile detention facility in upstate New York. It wasn't the future anyone would have imagined for a world champion. What happened there changed everything. One of the counselors was Bobby Stewart, a former Golden Gloves boxer. At first, Stewart wasn't interested in becoming anyone's mentor. Tyson was just another teenager with a history of fighting and getting into trouble. Then they sparred. Years later, Stewart remembered that session with a mixture of surprise and respect. Tyson hit him so hard with a jab that it broke his nose. Stewart realized almost immediately that this wasn't ordinary teenage strength. There was something unusual about the boy standing in front of him. Stewart taught Mike everything he could. It didn't take long before he admitted he had reached his limit. There was someone else Tyson needed to meet. His name was Cus D'Amato. By the early 1980s, D'Amato was already one of boxing's most respected trainers. He had guided Floyd Patterson to a world title and spent decades studying not only technique, but the psychology of fighters. He believed that fear was something every boxer carried. The difference between champions and everyone else was not the absence of fear. It was learning what to do with it. When Tyson first arrived in Catskill, he expected another coach. He found something very different. Cus asked questions. He listened. He watched the teenager closely. He wasn't trying to discover how hard Mike could punch. He wanted to understand why he fought the way he did. Much later, Tyson would say that meeting Cus was the period of his life he most wished could be filmed all over again. Not because of the championships that came later, but because that was the first time he truly felt someone believed in him. During a conversation with Theo Vaughn in 2026, Tyson became emotional while remembering those years. When asked how he knew Cus loved him, he quietly answered, "I had somebody I loved and they loved me," before asking to change the subject because it had become too painful. That moment tells you almost everything you need to know. People often say, Cus D'Amato built Mike Tyson into a champion. That's true, but before he built a champion, he gave a frightened teenager something much rarer. He gave him a place where he finally felt that he mattered. The boxing came after that. And once it did, the change happened faster than anyone outside that small gym in Catskill could have imagined. The first thing people noticed about Mike Tyson was his power. The second was his speed. What they couldn't see was the amount of repetition behind both. Life with Cus D'Amato followed a rhythm that left very little room for distractions. Tyson trained. He cleaned the gym. He went to school. He came back and trained again. Cus insisted on discipline outside the ring as much as inside it. Tyson later recalled that his mentor watched who he spent time with, expected him to do chores, improve his grades, and develop habits that had nothing to do with throwing punches. That structure was unfamiliar to him. For most of his childhood, every day had been unpredictable. Now, almost every hour had a purpose. Years later, Tyson didn't remember those years by talking about championships. He remembered the feeling of finally belonging somewhere. One afternoon, during a recent conversation with Theo Von, he was asked which period of his life he wished someone had filmed. He didn't mention becoming world champion. He didn't mention Madison Square Garden. He didn't mention the millions of dollars. He answered almost immediately, "The time when I first met Cuss." Then he explained why. "Started boxing. Started changing my life." The words came easily. The emotions didn't. When the conversation turned to how he knew Cuss loved him, Tyson stopped speaking for a few seconds before quietly saying, "I had somebody I loved, and they loved me." A moment later, he asked to change the subject. It was still too painful. That tells you something statistics never could. People often describe Cus D'Amato as the trainer who created Mike Tyson. Tyson remembers him first as the man who made him feel safe. The boxing was important. The relationship came before the boxing. Cuss also introduced Tyson to an idea that stayed with him for the rest of his career. He used to say that fear wasn't the enemy. Everyone feels fear. Champions simply learn to act while carrying it. That philosophy became the foundation of everything Tyson would later do in the ring. The peekaboo style, the constant head movement, the explosive entries. They were technical expressions of a much deeper lesson about controlling fear instead of denying it. The training itself was relentless. Hours of slipping punches, shadowboxing, footwork, heavy bag, more footwork. Then it all started again the next day. People sometimes imagine Tyson becoming great because he could hit harder than everyone else. That wasn't enough. There have been plenty of hard punchers. Very few moved the way he moved at 19. Very few could explode from outside punching range and land combinations before an opponent had time to react. That wasn't natural talent alone. It was repetition. Thousands of rounds that almost nobody ever saw. Cuss understood something else too. He knew the world would eventually try to convince Tyson that he was invincible. He tried to protect him from that. One lesson stayed with Tyson decades later. Never speak negatively about yourself. Cuss believed the subconscious accepted those words whether you meant them or not. Tyson recently smiled while remembering that advice, saying he had learned it at 12 years old because he needed it long before he became champion. Outside the gym, the rest of the boxing world had barely heard his name. Inside small amateur tournaments, people were beginning to notice. Coaches whispered about a teenager from Catskill. Opponents realized that surviving 3 rounds against him already felt like an accomplishment. By the time Tyson turned professional in 1985, the expectations around him had quietly become enormous. His debut lasted less than 2 minutes. Then came another fight. Another quick finish. Then another. He fought so often that sports pages sometimes struggled to keep up. 15 professional fights in his first year. Most ended before the opening round had fully settled in. While the public was just beginning to learn his name, something devastating happened behind the scenes. Cus D'Amato became seriously ill. Tyson visited him in the hospital. The conversations were shorter now. The training sessions became fewer. Everyone around them understood what Tyson refused to accept. In November 1985, Cuss died from pneumonia. He was 77 years old. Tyson was only 19. People often say Tyson lost his trainer that day. That isn't really how he describes it. Listening to him now, it sounds much closer to losing a father. The strange part is what happened next. Instead of slowing down, Mike Tyson fought as though every victory still had to be shown to the one person who was no longer there. A year later, the entire world would finally learn his name. When Mike Tyson climbed through the ropes at the Las Vegas Hilton, he was only 20 years old. Trevor Berbick was the champion. On paper, that mattered. Inside the arena, it didn't feel that way. Most of the attention had already shifted to the challenger. For months, boxing fans had been asking the same question. Not whether Tyson would become champion, how long it would take. That kind of expectation can crush a young fighter, or it can change the way everyone watches the sport. Tyson walked to the ring wearing the same black trunks he always wore. No robe covered with sponsors, no elaborate entrance, no performance for the cameras. Just the same expression people had started recognizing. Calm, almost distant. Years later, several opponents admitted that the hardest part wasn't getting hit. It was everything that happened before the opening bell. Tyson looked completely convinced that he belonged there. That certainty spread across the ring. You can see it if you watch the fight today. Berbick keeps moving. Tyson keeps closing the distance. Nothing about it feels rushed. He's not chasing. He's cutting the ring into smaller and smaller pieces. The pressure starts long before the first clean punch lands. The opening round lasted only a few minutes, but it answered almost every question people still had. Tyson wasn't simply faster. He saw openings earlier. His head moved constantly. His feet never seemed to cross. Every punch had a purpose. There was very little wasted movement. People often remember the knockouts. Watching those old fights again, something else stands out. Efficiency. Nothing looked accidental. By the second round, Berbick was already struggling to keep Tyson in front of him. A combination sent the champion backward. Then another. A left hook changed everything. Berbick hit the canvas. He stood up, or at least he tried to. His legs wouldn't cooperate. He fell again, managed to stand, lost his balance once more. Referee Mills Lane stopped the fight. It lasted 5 minutes and 35 seconds. Mike Tyson had just become the youngest heavyweight champion in boxing history. That record still hasn't been broken. The celebration was surprisingly brief. Tyson smiled. He accepted the belt. People around him shouted. Photographers pushed closer. Promoters celebrated. It looked like the beginning of a dynasty. Then he said something that almost gets forgotten. I'm the youngest heavyweight champion of the world, and I'm going to be the oldest. It's an unforgettable quote because it sounds like confidence. Looking back now, it also sounds like a young man who believed the future could only keep getting better. There was one person missing that night. Cus D'Amato. He had died only weeks before the fight. Tyson dedicated the victory to him. The cameras captured the celebration. They couldn't capture the absence. For everyone else, this was the night Mike Tyson arrived. For Tyson himself, it was probably impossible not to think about the man who had spent years telling him this day would come. The strange thing about success is how quickly it changes expectations. The morning after beating Berbick, nobody asked whether Tyson would become the face of heavyweight boxing. That discussion was already over. The questions became much bigger. Could anyone beat him? Could anyone survive him? Could this 20-year-old dominate the division for the next decade? Every fight suddenly felt like an event. People bought tickets hoping to witness history. Others secretly wondered if they were about to watch the impossible. Someone finally stopping Mike Tyson. Instead, the opposite happened. The victories kept coming. James Smith, Tony Tucker, Bone Crusher Smith, Larry Holmes. Each win added another layer to the legend. By 1987, Tyson had unified the WBC, WBA, and IBF heavyweight championships, becoming the undisputed heavyweight champion of his era. The young man from Brownsville had gone from juvenile detention to the top of boxing in only a few years. From the outside, his life looked almost perfect. He had fame, money, championship belts, the respect of the boxing world. Everything people spend their lives chasing. But the people closest to him were beginning to notice something. The boy, who once needed structure, was suddenly living in a world where almost nobody dared tell him no. That would become a much bigger fight than anything waiting for him inside the ring. Success didn't arrive all at once. It arrived one person at a time. One interview, one endorsement, one appearance, one new face asking to be part of Mike Tyson's life. By the end of the 1980s, there seemed to be no limit to where his name could appear. Television commercials, magazine covers, talk shows, corporate events. Everywhere Tyson went, people wanted something. A photograph, a business deal, a favor, a promise. At 21, he had become one of the most recognizable athletes in the world. The difficult part wasn't becoming famous. It was figuring out who could still be trusted. When Cus D'Amato was alive, Tyson's world had been remarkably small. Cus, Jim Jacobs, Kevin Rooney, a handful of people who had known him before he became a celebrity. They argued with him, corrected him, Sometimes they told him things he didn't want to hear. Tyson didn't always enjoy it. Looking back, he often speaks about those years as the period when his life had the most structure. After Cuss died, that structure slowly began to disappear. Not overnight. Little by little, Jim Jacobs, who had become much more than Tyson's manager, was diagnosed with leukemia. He remained close to Tyson while receiving treatment, but his health continued to decline. He died in 1988. Tyson was only 22. Within a few years, two of the people who had guided almost every important decision in his life were gone. The timing could hardly have been worse, because outside that small circle, another powerful figure had become impossible to ignore. Don King. King was already one of boxing's biggest promoters. He understood television. He understood publicity. More importantly, he understood how to build enormous events around extraordinary fighters. Eventually, Tyson signed with him. The partnership helped produce some of the biggest boxing events of the era. It also became one of the most debated relationships in modern sports. Years later, Tyson repeatedly claimed he had been financially exploited and manipulated during that period, accusations that eventually led to legal battles between the two men. At the same time, Tyson's personal life was becoming front-page news. In 1988, he married actress Robin Givens. For a brief moment, they looked like one of America's most famous young couples. Magazine covers, television appearances. Photographers followed them almost everywhere. Then the headlines changed. The marriage quickly became public in a way neither of them could control. Arguments that should have remained private became national news. The interview with Barbara Walters is still difficult to watch today. Sitting beside Tyson, Givens described life with him as torture and spoke about his volatile behavior. Tyson said very little. He mostly stared ahead. Millions of Americans watched. The marriage ended less than a year later amid allegations, lawsuits, and intense media attention. Both Tyson and Givens have described that relationship very differently over the years, and it remains one of the most disputed chapters of Tyson's life. It's tempting to treat those events as separate stories. The promoter, the marriage, the fame, the money. But they were all happening at nearly the same time. And Tyson was still in his early 20s. That's easy to forget. Today, we think of Mike Tyson as a legend. Back then, he was a young man, carrying responsibilities that most people never experience in an entire lifetime. The strange part is that none of this seemed to affect him inside the ring. At least, not immediately. He kept winning. He dismantled Michael Spinks in just 91 seconds. He defended his titles again. The aura remained intact. From the outside, it looked as though nothing had changed. Inside his own circle, people were beginning to notice something different. Training camps no longer felt the same. Old routines disappeared. New faces appeared. The discipline that had once defined every day was becoming harder to maintain. Not because Tyson had forgotten how to work, because there were now countless distractions competing for his attention. Years later, boxing writer Mark Kriegel made an observation that feels especially important. He argued that Tyson's greatest loss wasn't physical. It was the gradual disappearance of the people willing to tell him, no. Without that kind of guidance, even extraordinary talent becomes difficult to protect. The public couldn't see any of this. All they saw was the undefeated heavyweight champion, the man who looked invincible, the man who seemed impossible to beat. What almost nobody realized was that the next opponent waiting for Mike Tyson wasn't standing across a boxing ring. He was waiting in Tokyo, and his name was James Buster Douglas. For nearly 4 years, nobody had found an answer. 37 professional fights. 37 victories. Most of them weren't close. Some opponents looked defeated before the opening bell even rang. That was Tyson's greatest weapon. Not his left hook, not his uppercut. Expectation. People expected him to win. Opponents expected him to hurt them. The public expected another knockout. When enough people believe the same thing, it starts to feel permanent. James Buster Douglas never seemed interested in that story. When the fight was announced, almost no one gave him a chance. Some sportsbooks listed him as a 42-1 underdog. The conversation wasn't about whether Douglas could win. It was about who Tyson would fight after him. Evander Holyfield was already being discussed as the next major event. Douglas had something the public couldn't measure. 3 weeks before the fight, his mother died. People close to him wondered whether he should even continue training. Instead, he threw himself into camp. Later, Douglas said he had promised his mother he would become heavyweight champion. For him, Tokyo wasn't just another fight. It felt like the last chance to keep that promise. Tyson arrived in Japan carrying something very different. Years later, in his autobiography, he admitted he never truly respected the challenge. He wrote that he didn't even bother studying Douglas carefully because he believed the outcome was already decided. Looking back, it was one of the most brutally honest admissions of his career. The fight began quietly. No dramatic moment, no instant knockout. Douglas established his jab almost immediately. Again. If you watch the first few rounds today, something unusual stands out. Tyson keeps trying to enter the pocket the way he always had. Douglas keeps meeting him before he gets there. Not with one spectacular punch, with fundamentals. A long jab, good footwork, patience. The rhythm of the fight never became Tyson's rhythm. That almost never happened. By the middle rounds, Tyson's left eye had started to swell. His corner looked unsettled. They searched for an end swell to reduce the swelling and couldn't find one, using an improvised cold compress instead. It was a small detail, but it told a much bigger story. For years, Tyson's team had looked prepared for everything. That night, they suddenly looked ordinary. Then came the 8th round. For a few seconds, everything looked familiar again. Tyson landed a right uppercut. Douglas crashed to the canvas. The arena erupted. People watching around the world assumed the fight was over. Douglas beat the count. There would be debate afterward about how long that count lasted. The arguments lasted for years. Douglas kept fighting. That's the part that mattered. Something changed after that. In previous Tyson fights, opponents often lost confidence once they had been hurt. Douglas seemed to gain it. He came back behind the jab. He walked forward again. For the first time in a long time, Tyson looked like the man trying to solve the puzzle instead of creating it. The 10th round has become one of boxing's most recognizable sequences. Douglas landed a sharp uppercut. Then another combination. Tyson stumbled backward. A left hook followed. The undisputed heavyweight champion fell to the canvas for the first knockdown of his professional career. He reached for his mouthpiece, tried to put it back in, looked toward the referee, then looked down again. It was over. The headlines called it the greatest upset in boxing history. They're probably right. But what happened afterward interests me even more. For years, people believed Mike Tyson had been something beyond human, invincible, untouchable, unavoidable. Tokyo changed that in less than 40 minutes. Not because Tyson suddenly became a bad fighter, because everyone finally remembered that he was a man. Years later, Tyson himself looked back on that defeat in a surprisingly different way. Instead of calling it the worst night of his career, he said losing eventually freed him from the impossible burden of having to remain undefeated forever. It stripped away the image that had become heavier than the championship belts themselves. Most champions spend their careers trying to avoid one defeat. Mike Tyson spent the rest of his career trying to understand what that defeat had revealed about him. And before he could answer that question, life was about to test him in ways no opponent ever could. On March 26, 1995, Mike Tyson walked out of the Indiana Youth Center wearing ordinary clothes. There were no championship belts, no television lights waiting inside a packed arena, no roaring crowd, just reporters, cameras, questions. 3 years earlier, he had entered prison as one of the most famous athletes in the world after being convicted of raping Desiree Washington. Tyson has always maintained that the encounter was consensual, but the jury found him guilty in 1992. He was sentenced to 6 years and was released on parole after serving about 3 years. Whether people believed the verdict or not, one thing was undeniable. The Mike Tyson who left prison wasn't the same man who had entered it. Boxing had moved on. Evander Holyfield had become champion. Riddick Bowe had changed the heavyweight landscape. New names filled the rankings. For the first time since he was a teenager, Tyson wasn't the center of the boxing world. He had to earn his place again. That sounds obvious now. At the time, it wasn't. Because even after 3 years away, promoters still believed one thing. If Mike Tyson fought, people would watch. They were right. His comeback fight against Peter McNeely in August 1995 became one of the biggest pay-per-view events the sport had ever seen. The fight lasted just 89 seconds. McNeely's manager climbed into the ring before the referee could officially stop the contest. It was chaotic, almost surreal, and somehow it felt familiar. For one night, it looked as though nothing had changed. But boxing has a way of revealing things slowly. Over the next year, Tyson won back portions of the heavyweight championship, defeating Frank Bruno for the WBC title and Bruce Seldon for the WBA belt. The headlines celebrated a remarkable comeback. The king is back, the baddest man on the planet. Those were the stories people wanted to tell. Tyson later admitted that he wanted to believe them too, because believing them meant believing the lost years could simply be erased. They couldn't. There was one fight everyone had wanted since the late 1980s. Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield. It should have happened years earlier. Instead, life had intervened. When they finally met in November 1996, Holyfield wasn't supposed to win. Many experts thought his best years were behind him after heart problems and difficult fights. Tyson entered as the favorite. The fight didn't follow the script. Holyfield refused to be intimidated. He absorbed Tyson's early attacks. Then he began walking forward. Punch after punch. Round after round. By the 11th, the referee stepped in. Tyson had lost. Again. This defeat felt different from Tokyo. Buster Douglas had shocked the world. Holyfield convinced it. People no longer wondered whether Mike Tyson could be beaten. Now they knew exactly how. 7 months later, they met again. Everyone remembers what happened. You don't have to love boxing to know the image. Third round. Clinch. Tyson leaned in, then bit Holyfield's right ear. The fight stopped. Doctors examined the injury. After the action resumed, Tyson bit the other ear. Referee Mills Lane had seen enough. Disqualification. Within minutes, one of the greatest fighters in history had become the center of one of the most infamous moments in sports history. People have spent decades trying to explain why it happened. Anger, frustration, headbutts, pressure. Tyson himself has given different explanations over the years. Maybe that's because there isn't one simple answer. Human beings rarely fall apart for one reason. It's usually many small things arriving at the same time. Looking back now, something else stands out. The newspapers talked almost entirely about the bite. Very few asked what kind of emotional state a person had to reach before making a decision like that on live television. That doesn't excuse it. It simply reminds us that headlines often capture the loudest moment, not the longest story. Years later, Tyson became surprisingly direct when speaking about those years. He didn't pretend they were misunderstood. He didn't claim they represented the best version of himself. Instead, he often described that period as a time when anger was making decisions faster than reason could catch up. His later interviews repeatedly acknowledge how unstable and self-destructive he had become, despite remaining one of the sport's biggest attractions. For many athletes, that would have been the end of the story. For Mike Tyson, it wasn't, because the hardest fights of his life were no longer happening inside a boxing ring. They were waiting for him after the crowds had gone home.